Based on a remark of Sir Peter, globalization was always there. In fact, till recently, it was politically accepted, but that in recent times, with the rise of development, various known, unknown, visible and invisible barriers are coming up. So my question to you is, in the light of fundamental change in the component elements of globalization, how development can really help migration? Thank you. Over to you, sir.
Well, each of the excellent questions would deserve a speech in itself, and contrary to my normal way, I'm going to try to be very concise in answering you. The response of the rest of the world to the European crisis. Well, first of all, let me say this. There are two elements to the European crisis. One element is the extent of the focus on it because of the internal media, the political changes in Europe and so on, or a demonstration of the problems of international cooperation in an area that held itself out as an integrated union of European states. I think that's largely, overwhelmingly, a European problem. They have to get their act together. I'm an absolute believer in European integration. I think that some are leading and some are opposing the integration on this issue that is required. A common European policy in regard to migration based upon a liberal interpretation rather than a nationalist one in continental terms can only be brought together by a common European policy. We can't have every state going its own way, destroying Schengen, recreating borders that collapsed, particularly post-1989 in Europe. And we need a much more cooperative Europe. They have to solve the problem to a considerable extent. The external world, however, is also a responsibility. The resettlement that was available globally for the Vietnam process, and even in the current situation, the United States, Canada, Brazil, three countries, for an example, have already opened their doors to an extent in regard to taking in resettlement. But this is inadequate. We need far more openings to resettlement. It's not an issue defined by proximity, as I said, so it's a global issue. So that's what I would say. I would say the Europeans have to primarily get their act together, and they've been fracturing rather than combining. They have to have a common policy. I think the European Commission has been leading well and deserves credit. I think some states within Europe have been generous. Sweden, particularly, Germany, have both given examples, so have others, which is important. Internally displaced, a huge problem, in fact, numerically a larger problem than the international migration issue. Of that there is no doubt. It's not a denial of that, but what we have been focused on, and I have been focused on, and my role is related to, is the international aspect of migration. Some of the examples and many of the things that we're doing in the Global Forum can be applied to internal displacement also. But I want to be careful that I don't broaden the remit of what I'm trying to do to a level which makes it impossible to achieve concrete achievements in a defined area. And that defined area has been international migration. I'm not devaluing the other, I'm just saying that that's important. I think in regard to globalization, the interlinkages between development, globalization, and I say this as somebody who has always been in favor of open borders, both for trade I'm anti-protectionist. I believe that the responsibility for the failure of the Doha round can be spread over both some developed and some developing countries. And if anything, again being very blunt about it, the bigger responsibility in terms of self-interest has been the failure of some developing countries to step up to the plate and to recognize that a multilateral system is much better than a bilateral system in terms of trade negotiation, which ultimately is used to the disadvantage of the developing world. I think that that's been a mistake by some major developing countries in failing to recognize that they should be embracing globalization in that commercial area. But I better not get into something which is another debate in itself. Today we have, I finally say, a whole group of countries who are increasingly engaged in this. I think the permanent members of the Security Council have a particularly important role in leadership in this coming year and a need to engage in this issue. The United States is playing a very important role at the moment, for an example, in the migrants in crisis and in support of the conference which we will be having at the end of the year. That's very different from the initial position in an earlier time, which I experienced when I first took on this job. The US, with many other countries, was saying this is a matter of national sovereignty. We're not going to get involved. You're not going to interfere with what we're doing. What we're doing is under our constitution and our law to protect and define the rights of people in our state. That's a problem which many countries have, particularly those with particular strength and power. The United States now, I would see, as one of the leaders in this whole process in a very constructive way. I would say that others are playing that role too, and increasingly so. Brazil, for an example, taking some resettlement cases. And there's signs of increasing engagement, I hope, from Russia. And I hope that Bangladesh plays a significant role in bringing China into this in an active way, which has not been the case so far. This all has to happen, and the leadership of the most powerful becomes the most important. So the Migrants in Crisis initiative with the Philippines playing, as it often does, because of its focus on this issue, as Bangladesh should have also and has. The Philippines, the United States, and the Migrants in Crisis initiative is very important. So we have to get everybody mobilized, and hopefully we will do so.
Maybe it's not working. Can you speak to one of those mic on the table? Yes, thank you.
Chair. My name is Reza. I'm working for a coastal NGO in Bangladesh. I have been following the climate negotiation for last 10 years, including the Paris Climate Conference. My question is to Sir Peter Sutherland. And you know that according to the different scientific report, there will be 30 to 50 million climate displaced people in Bangladesh in next 100 years. It means in each of the 5 there will be 1 climate displaced people. And if you consider the report from Stern report, there will be 1 in each 20 people, climate displaced people in the whole over the world. So what do you think that there should be one new UN protocol to cover this climate force displacement, as because if you consider the Bangladeshi situation of this displacement, Bangladesh is not at all responsible for this.
Understood. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, the lady at the back.
Thank you, sir. Am I allowed to ask more than one question very briefly?
Let's stick to one question.
Oh, thank you, sir. Then I have to choose. First, if I'm not wrong, respected keynote presenter, Sir Peter Sutherland, have made a comment like this. Migration does not create unemployment. it creates employment. Can you please shed some more light on how migration can create employment in destination country? And my second question.
Let's stick to one. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much. My question is actually regard to the environmental refugee or climate refugee. And as you know, the migrants, international migrants, always helping development in both countries, the countries where they live and the countries where they gone actually, that means receiving and destined countries both together, unlike the non-migrant population. And the refugees is one of the most important part because the world community already accepted the convention. Yeah, world community has already accepted the conventional refugees, but they're reluctant to accept the environmental refugees or climate refugees. My question is why it is so, and how can we actually accept those kind of environmental or what you call climate refugees?
Particularly in this country, the climate change, the first and the third question. I've already indicated that there is, to me, a big issue that we have to address this year in recognizing that refugees, as defined, and I don't think we should play around with that definition, because if we do play around with the definition of refugees as persecuted people, it will result in it being reduced in scope rather than expanded in scope. So let's protect what the refugee is. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a huge anomaly here. And the anomaly is, why should we protect those who are persecuted and escaping from terrible violence and not protect those in the same way who are escaping from an environmental challenge which is just as threatening to their lives? Now, my political response to that is that the only way of dealing with this is, first of all, put a barbed wire fence, which we seem to be so good at in some senses, around the refugee issue, and open up a discussion on the other, which is going to be the challenge of the forthcoming generations, not least here. We have to say to the rest of the world, your responsibility doesn't end with the moral responsibility to refugees as currently defined. An equally important challenge related to the mortality of humanity is the issue of vulnerable migrants faced with disaster. The Crisis Migrants Initiative, which I've been mentioning, and which is championed by the states that I have mentioned, is one element in what we're talking about. There are other initiatives which are also taking place. And this debate has to take place at the end of this year, not confined to dealing with Syrian refugees, important and vital though that is, but also recognizing the rights of those faced with humanitarian challenges just as challenging and dreadful in their consequences. So we're trying to handle this. I'm very conscious of it, and particularly I feel I have a responsibility to give voice to the concerns of vulnerable migrants more generally identified. The creation of employment. Well, somebody, I think it was John Galbraith, said the only race in the world that has never produced a formidable economist are the Irish, because they say that they devote themselves to higher arts like writing poetry and so on. So I'm not going to give the economist's answer to the question as to how migration helps growth and does not damage the rights of individual workers, except to say two things. One, it is proven to be the case It is proven to be the case because migrants add a dynamism to an economy that virtually no other group in society ever does. The people who have the courage to go, and I'm not inducing people to go, are the people who have driven economic growth all over the world. The population growth that so many worry about, and I can understand its disadvantages here in Bangladesh, as some may argue, or elsewhere, is also part of a development paradigm that is positive. The 10 countries in the world with the biggest demographic problem are all in Europe, and most of them are the countries who are absolutely opposed to migration. They're going to have, in 30 or 40 years' time, an enormous challenge of a huge retired population supported by a dwindling working population. They actually need more than the biggest numbers that are postulated today. But their politicians are afraid to tell their own people that this is it. They better get used to, in their own self-interest, a multicultural society, because without immigrants, their societies will die and will not be able to sustain themselves economically. So I think I'll leave it there, those questions.
Thank you, sir.
One of the problems here in the countries of destination is that there's been an inadequate policy development in internal politics in terms of the integration process that is necessary to avoid crises. The result is that in some communities, and this is also a responsibility of the migrants, the ghettoization, the creation of distinct communities who want to live together, talk together, fail to learn the language of the country to which they go, failure to recognize that the values of the societies into which they must integrate, they have to respect. And that includes difficult issues, the equality of man and woman. We can't avoid issues like this. Migrants have a responsibility to integrate. So does the country of destination have an obligation to help them to integrate by providing educational facilities, by education in terms of language, education in terms of all aspects of social development. There are countries which are trying this and doing their best, including, I should say, Germany, who have had a great deal of experience with Turkish migrants over a very prolonged period, and who are playing such an important role as a potential successor, incidentally, in the Global Forum. So this is important. Integration is vital, and it's part of the agenda which is being set by Bangladesh to start within the Global Forum to really take advantage of this, because there are examples that can be used who have been looking at this and are trying to deal with it, even though the problems are significant. For an example, Sweden. Conventions. The difficulty about conventions is that they can become an all-consuming debate without end. The adoption of conventions, which I strongly recommend, is something on which some countries are absolutely, irrevocably, currently opposed. I'm not going to spend more time than the exhortation that we can give and continue to give to get more adoptions. We've tried to hit on the absolutely irrefutable need for the Domestic Workers Convention to be ratified. Domestic workers, everybody in the world knows that they're abused. Women are being abused all over the world. I don't think there's any answer to the demand, which has to be publicly increasingly exposed in debate, to countries who refuse to adopt the Domestic Workers Convention. Once that bridge is surmounted, at least a principle in terms of the relevance of conventions is established, and the broader convention in regard to migrant workers becomes a debatable issue in a way that it isn't currently. And that's absolutely necessary. So conventions are vital, inclusiveness is vital, but in the end of the day, the inclusiveness argument, just to come back to it, to avoid the clash of civilizations which Samuel Huntington wrote about, and which seems to become manifest by the day, particularly if you listen to some of the appalling pronouncements of ISIS, that has to be dealt with by active inclusion in every society to ensure that people are not divided because of race or religion, but become part of the societies they're in. And we have to resist the appalling and utterly destructive attacks on the dignity of the human person that are implicit in those who say that we must have a clash of civilizations. We have to avoid it. That also, finally, I'm repeating myself, means that those who maintain and develop in countries of destination the rights to go there that we are trying to assert on their behalf, those who go to countries of destination and then become divisive figures within those societies, cannot request or demand the right to stay. In my opinion, if you deny the values that are part of our societies, then you're going to face, and should face, the risk of being sent home.
Like socioeconomic imbalance and instabilities, crime, law and order, and environmental issues, as well as trafficking and illegal immigration issues becoming more prominent, giving rise to questions of governance. We have seen people in large numbers moving across borders in search of security and better life. We have seen such vulnerable people being exploited in various ways. We have also seen some of these people on the move in their vulnerability and uncertainty, giving rise to various other socioeconomic and legal challenges. We have seen all these happening in Africa, Middle East and Europe, as well as in South and Southeast Asia, with innumerous stories of sufferings and tragedies unfolding. In this backdrop, today's seminar is not only very timely but also extremely useful. We have heard the experts speak on the various aspects of migration and development, challenges and perspectives. The keynote address by His Excellency Sir Peter Sutherland, SRSG, on migration and development has given us a very enlightening and comprehensive understanding of the matter. The Foreign Secretary, Mr. MD Shahidul Haq, Ambassador Eva Ackerman Bourrier, and Mr. John Bingham have ably complemented the SRSG in focusing on the rights of the migrants, both in the country of origin and the country of destination. They also emphasized the need to have an appropriate governance regime to ensure the rights of the migrants on the one hand, and the need for orderly and properly recorded movement, sheltering, rehabilitation and resettlement, as well as the process of smooth integration in the destination country, causing least disturbance to the host society, its socio-economic stability, law and order and environment.